In this next segment, all you'll need is a fresh scene and the material editor. Again, you get there by hitting the letter M for material editor on your keyboard. Let's front and center this bad boy here. And in this segment, we're going to cover the different types of materials. So far, we've just covered maps and different properties and parameters of a standard material. But there are a whole lot more material types out there than just standard. If you want to refer back to my hierarchy analogy, where this is the parent level and different map levels are children of the parents, then you could think of different materials as different families. We access different materials by hitting the standard button. But before we do that, I want to show you a few other things real quick about shaders. By default, we're set up with a blend shader. Click this drop down. We'll see that there are many different types of shaders. Again, it's beyond the scope of this training series to go through these, but I want to give you a basic introduction to them. Blend is the default, and it's a pretty good all-around shader. But as you keep your eye on the sample sphere, as I change the shader type, you'll see big differences here. You see, anisotropic changes the type of specular highlight. As I bump up the specular level here, we have a specular highlight that breaks off in two directions. Bump up anisotropy here, or take it down, and you can see that we're changing the shape of our specular highlight. This usually works pretty good for metals and other shiny surfaces. There's also metal, which as I bump up the specular level, you'll see something pretty interesting. Again, remember that most metals have a peculiar attribute, and that their reflection, in that their specular highlight is typically the color of the metal and not the color of the light. With most other objects, say with wood or glass or plastic, or pretty much just about anything else, when light hits it, the specular highlight is the color of the light. When light hits metal, typically the color of the specular highlight is the color of the object. And so that's why we have a metal shader. Oren-Nayar blend is another one that I use very often. And it's kind of ironic because I use Oren-Nayar blend for really dull materials, like a clay pot or something. So it's really funny that it looks really blown out, but it demonstrates a great principle. As you switch back and forth between different shaders, it does its best to maintain the settings you already had with the last shader. So I'm going to select a new sample slot and now change this to Oren-Nayar blend, and you'll see that it got a very matted finish to it. As we bump up the specular level, you can see it's a very dull finish. Again, great for clay and other dull matted surfaces. And as you can see, there are others to play with. I just wanted to give you a basic idea of what these shaders do. They can come in real handy. And now let's get on to talking about materials. Let's hit that standard button, and we get the material map browser. But this time, instead of seeing little green polygons, which are the icons for maps, we're seeing these blue spheres, which are the icons for materials. And so all that we've talked about so far are just standard materials, but as you can see, there's a whole load of stuff to choose from. Perhaps one of the coolest is ink and paint. Now you'll notice over here that we're getting a thumbnail as we go from material to material. And as we click ink and paint, you get a pretty good idea of what ink and paint does. Ink and paint applies a very cartoony material to an object. This is often called a toon shader in the industry because it resembles a cartoon so much. In the video game world, this is referred to as cel shading. One of my favorite video games, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker for GameCube, is all cel shading. Produces a sweet effect. As a matter of fact, this morning, before I came into the lynda.com studios to do this training, I was in my hotel doing the standard Saturday morning Chad Perkins routine in my jammies, watching Saturday morning cartoons, eating Cookie Crisp. And as I was watching my Saturday morning cartoons, it really hit me how much they're using 3D objects even in flat hand-drawn animation. As I was flipping back and forth through the channels, which I do during commercial, I remember seeing helicopters come in and swirl around in 2D animations, but they were actually 3D objects composited in using these toon shader materials. So you see these all over the place. Unfortunately, the settings for ink and paint aren't so kid-like. It's pretty complicated. And for experimentation, I really recommend having the help menu out as you're kind of going through and exploring that. Just a few others. Shellac is a great material for car paint. As we double-click to apply this here, We'll get the option to keep the old material as a sub-material or to just completely throw away the old material. And that's what I want to do. So I'm going to hit OK. And you'll see here we have a base and a shellac. That's what makes a car paint job look so great. There's a base color, which typically is the paint job. And so here we have the base material, which is essentially the color of the car. And then we have the shellac material, which is a coating over the top of our paint. Typically for shellac materials, you'd want just a standard paint on the base and maybe a ray trace material for reflections on the shellac. Let's go ahead and hit the shellac button to change this material. Be aware that there's also an architectural material. Now, as you explore 3ds Max 9 and the files that come with Max, you'll see that there are loads of architectural maps. But this is not an architectural map, this is an architectural material set up to give you the parameters that you would need to adjust a standard architectural material, whether for concrete, for tile, for wood floors, or what have you. There's also a ray trace material. And although the settings are a little bit more complicated with the ray trace material than with the ray trace map, from my experience, I find that the ray trace material works a little bit better than the ray trace map. And the last one I want to mention to you is this matte shadow parameter. We can't really go into this too much in this essentials title, but matte shadow essentially knocks out whatever it's applied to clear through the background. I use this effect all the time in compositing. So if you find that compositing is going to be part of your workflow, definitely check out the matte shadow material. So that's a basic summary of the possible materials that are available to you here in Max. There are significantly more. Later on, we'll talk about Mental Ray, and when we change our rendering system to Mental Ray, we get additional materials for that rendering system. Now let's go on and conclude our discussion on materials by talking about all the free stuff when it comes to maps and materials that ship with Max.